My name is Simone. I am 32 years old, and after 5 years of building a life with the man I loved, he suddenly decided to get married. But the bride was someone else. I quietly walked away. He told me to never contact him again. I calmly replied, okay. But just a few days later, he was completely stunned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever felt betrayed by the people you trusted most. The air inside the restaurant was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted herbs. This was not just any restaurant. It was the most exclusive dining room in Midtown Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the tables, illuminating the faces of the city's black elite. Politicians, real estate moguls, and successful entrepreneurs filled the room, their laughter mingling with the smooth sounds of a live jazz quartet playing softly in the corner. I stood near the back of the room holding a slender glass of champagne, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement in my stomach. Tonight was supposed to be our night. DeAndre and I had been together for exactly 5 years. 5 years of late nights, shared dreams, and quiet sacrifices. I wore a simple black dress, nothing too flashy because I never needed to be the center of attention. DeAndre was the one who loved the spotlight. He was 35 years old, the charismatic director of a luxury lifestyle brand, and he thrived in rooms like this. I was perfectly content to stand in the shadows and let him shine. I watched him navigate the room, his custom-tailored suit fitting his tall frame perfectly. I smiled, remembering how hard we had worked to get here. He looked every bit the self-made millionaire he claimed to be. I took a sip of my champagne, letting the crisp bubbles dance on my tongue. My heart raced as I saw him approach the small stage at the front of the dining room. The jazz quartet faded into silence as he tapped the microphone. The soft thud echoed through the room, drawing everyone's attention. The chatter died down, replaced by an expectant hush. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. My friends had hinted at it all week. DeAndre had rented out the entire venue, invited the most important people in our social circle, and hired a professional photographer who was currently hovering near the stage. I set my champagne glass down on a nearby cocktail table, my hands trembling slightly. I smoothed the front of my dress and took a deep breath. "Good evening, everyone," DeAndre said, his deep, resonant voice filling the silent room. He flashed that million-dollar smile, the one that had captivated me 5 years ago. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. You represent the best of Atlanta, and having you here to celebrate this milestone means the world to me." The crowd murmured in agreement, raising their glasses in a silent toast. I smiled, feeling a swell of pride. 5 years ago, my life changed completely. He continued, looking out over the sea of faces. I started a journey to build something lasting, something meaningful. I wanted to create a legacy. He paused for dramatic effect, and the room hung on his every word. I felt tears pricking the corners of my eyes. He was talking about us. He was talking about the foundation we had built together, the struggles we had overcome, the future we were forging. "But a man cannot build an empire alone," DeAndre said, his voice softening into a tone of deep reverence. "He needs a queen by his side, someone who matches his energy, someone who understands the weight of greatness, someone who looks at the world and sees infinite possibilities." The crowd erupted into soft cheers and gentle applause. My chest felt tight with emotion. This was the most romantic thing he had ever done. I prepared myself to step into the light, to finally take my place beside him. And over these past few years, I have found that exact person, he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. I waited for his eyes to lock onto mine. But his eyes swept right past me, not even pausing, not even registering my presence. He looked toward the sweeping staircase at the back of the room. "Please welcome the love of my life, the woman who makes everything make sense," DeAndre announced. "Camille." The name hit me like a physical blow. The breath was knocked entirely out of my lungs. My mind went completely blank, refusing to process the sound of those syllables. Camille. It was not my name. It was a completely different person. The crowd parted, turning their attention toward the staircase. And there she was, Camille. She was 28 years old, a well-known socialite who was constantly striving to cement her status in the upper echelons of Atlanta society. She descended the stairs with the slow, deliberate grace of a beauty queen. She wore a stunning form-fitting red silk dress that caught every glimmer of light in the room. The fabric draped perfectly over her figure, trailing slightly behind her as she walked. Her hair was styled in flawless cascading waves and her makeup was immaculate. She looked like a movie star stepping onto the red carpet. She looked nothing like me. My feet felt as though they had been set in concrete. I could not move. I could not speak. I could only watch in mounting horror as the scene played out in front of me like a slow-motion nightmare. The crowd broke into thunderous applause, cheering and whistling as Camille glided through the parted sea of guests. People were smiling, clapping her on the back, offering words of congratulation. They knew. The realization crashed over me with the force of a tidal wave. They all knew. The elite politicians, the wealthy business owners, the socialites. They were not here to celebrate our 5-year anniversary. They were here to celebrate her. They were here to witness DeAndre pledge his life to another woman, while I stood in the back of the room oblivious and discarded. Camille reached the stage and DeAndre reached down to take her hand, helping her up the final step. He pulled her close, kissing her cheek softly before turning back to the microphone. "Camille," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are the fire in my life. You are the elegance, the grace, and the power that drives me forward. I cannot imagine spending another day on this earth without you as my wife." He handed the microphone to a groomsman standing nearby and reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a small, square velvet box. The room fell into an absolute breathless silence. The only sound was the frantic, erratic beating of my own heart against my ribs. DeAndre dropped to one knee right there on the stage. He opened the box, revealing a massive diamond ring. "Camille," he said, "will you marry me?" Camille raised her hands to her mouth in a perfectly choreographed display of shock and joy. She nodded her head enthusiastically, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes," she breathed into the microphone. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The restaurant exploded. The jazz quartet immediately struck up a triumphant, upbeat tune. The guests cheered wildly, raising their glasses high in the air. DeAndre slipped the massive diamond onto Camille's finger and stood up, pulling her into a deep, passionate kiss. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession, capturing the picture-perfect moment for all of Atlanta to see. And then, as they broke the kiss and turned to face the cheering crowd, Camille's eyes scanned the room. Her gaze swept over the applauding guests until it landed precisely on the dark corner where I was standing. Our eyes locked. For a fleeting second, the joyous facade dropped from her face, replaced by a look of absolute triumphant malice. She smirked at me. It was a small, subtle curling of her lips, a silent declaration of victory. She knew exactly who I was. She knew exactly what she had taken. And she wanted to make sure I witnessed every single second of my own replacement. The red silk of her dress seemed to mock me, a glaring symbol of her vibrant victory against my dull, practical existence. My vision began to blur, the edges of the room spinning dizzily. The noise of the cheering crowd transformed into a deafening, distorted roar in my ears. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead and the back of my neck. I looked around at the faces of the guests, searching for a single expression of confusion or pity. But there was none. They were entirely captivated by the golden couple on the stage. I was a ghost in my own life. I gripped the edge of the high-top table next to me, my knuckles turning white, as I tried to anchor myself to reality. The champagne glass I had set down earlier caught the light, sparkling like a cruel joke. Every promise DeAndre had ever made to me played in my head on a torturous loop, contrasting violently with the reality unfolding on the stage. He was smiling down at Camille with a look of pure adoration, a look I foolishly believed was reserved only for me. I realized then that my entire existence for the past 5 years had been a carefully constructed lie. I was not his partner. I was his stepping stone, a temporary convenience until he could secure the life he truly wanted. And now he had it. 5 years of dedication. 5 years. Wiped out in a single devastating speech. The man I loved was celebrating his engagement to someone else, standing in a room full of people who viewed me as nothing more than an invisible stepping stone. The betrayal was so deep, so completely comprehensive, that I could not even summon the energy to cry. I simply stood there frozen in the shadows, as the life I thought I had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I was abruptly pulled from my silent shock by a sharp, deliberate jab to my right shoulder. The impact forced me to stumble, my champagne glass sloshing its contents onto my black dress. I turned to see Vivian DeAndre's mother standing beside me. She did not offer an apology. Instead, she adjusted her designer shawl, her eyes raking over me with undisguised contempt. Tonight, she was practically glowing with immense satisfaction. She leaned in close, the heavy scent of her floral perfume masking the putrid stench of her absolute cruelty. "I hope you are not planning to make a scene, Simone," Vivian whispered, her tone sharp and venomous. "You should have known this day was coming. A man like my son was never going to settle for someone like you." I stared at her, the reality of her words sinking in like shards of glass. She had known. The entire family had known. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday gathering, every smile they had given me over the past 5 years was a calculated performance. They had watched me build him up, support his dreams, and quietly manage his life, all while knowing he was planning to replace me. "You are a paycheck to paycheck, nobody," Vivian continued, her voice dropping to a harsh hiss. "DeAndre is a CEO now. He is building a legacy. He needs a wife who can elevate his brand, not an unpolished woman who buys clothes off a discount rack. Look at Camille. She comes from real money. She has the right pedigree, connections, and sorority background. She belongs in our world. You are just a placeholder." Her words were designed to break me, to strip away whatever shred of dignity I had left. She wanted me to cry, to beg, to confirm her belief that I was weak and unworthy. But looking into Vivian's cold, calculating eyes, I felt something entirely different begin to take root inside me. The initial paralyzing shock was receding, replaced by a deep, clarifying calm. I did not shed a tear. I simply looked back at her, maintaining my composure. "I understand perfectly, Vivian," I replied, my voice steady and even. Vivian seemed slightly taken aback by my lack of hysterics, her brows furrowing in brief confusion before twisting back into a sneer. "Good. Then you will know to exit quietly through the back door before you embarrass yourself further." She turned on her heel and glided back toward the celebrating crowd, ready to claim her place next to her new daughter-in-law. I watched her go. The crowd shifted again. DeAndre was making his way through the room, leaving his new fiancée surrounded by friends. He marched straight toward my dark corner. There was no guilt in his expression, no remorse for the public execution of our relationship. There was only pure, unadulterated disgust. "What are you still doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "I thought you would have had the sense to leave the moment I took the stage." "You invited me here, DeAndre," I stated simply. "You told me tonight was a celebration of our last 5 years. I told you what you needed to hear so you would not ruin my engagement," he scoffed. "I needed you out of the apartment so I could move Camille's things in tomorrow. Let us be brutally honest, Simone. You and I have been over for a long time. You are suffocating. You have no ambition, no drive, no vision for the future. You are perfectly happy living a mediocre life, and I am destined for greatness." He leaned closer, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "I am a millionaire now. I run one of the most successful lifestyle brands in the city. I cannot have a woman like you dragging down my image. Camille understands my vision. She matches my energy. You do not belong in my world anymore." I listened to the man I had loved for 5 years reduce my entire existence to a burden. He truly believed his own lies. He truly believed he was a self-made titan of industry, completely blind to the reality of his own success. He had bought into his own illusion so deeply that he could no longer see the foundation holding him up. "So here is how this is going to work," DeAndre instructed, his tone dictatorial. "You are going to go back to the penthouse right now. You will pack your clothes and your cheap personal items, and you will be completely gone by 8:30 tomorrow morning. Leave the keys on the kitchen counter. Do not take anything else. The furniture, the electronics, the art, that all belongs to me." He paused, letting his harsh demands hang in the air. "And Simone, do not ever contact me again. Do not call. Do not text. Do not show up at my office. We are done. Have I made myself perfectly clear?" I looked at the arrogant man standing before me. He expected tears. He expected me to fall apart, to beg for another chance. He needed me to be the broken, discarded woman so he could fully step into his role as the powerful CEO. I refused to give him that satisfaction. The sadness had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating precision. "Okay," I said. Just one single word. No raising my voice, no dramatic declarations, just a calm agreement. DeAndre frowned, clearly unsettled by my lack of reaction. He searched my face for any sign of a breakdown, but found only a placid, unreadable mask. Annoyed that he was not getting the dramatic exit he anticipated, he huffed, turned around, and marched back into the bright lights to rejoin his new bride. I did not linger a moment longer. I turned away from the celebration, walked out the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, and stepped into the cool Atlanta night air. The valet brought my modest, unassuming sedan around. It was a 5-year-old car, reliable and clean, completely unremarkable among the fleet of luxury vehicles lined up along the curb. I tipped the valet, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. The silence of the car was a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the restaurant. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, staring out at the city skyline. I felt no urge to cry. The betrayal was profound, but it was eclipsed by a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. DeAndre and his family had shown me exactly who they were. They discarded me because they believed I was powerless, poor and dependent on their grace. They were absolutely wrong. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I bypassed my regular apps and opened a highly secured, encrypted financial portal. I typed in my master password and waited for the two-factor authentication to clear. The screen transitioned from black to a crisp white dashboard, displaying a massive portfolio of corporate assets, real estate holdings, and leveraged debt. This was my world, the world DeAndre claimed I did not belong in. For 5 years, I maintained the facade of a simple risk management analyst. I lived modestly, dressed practically, and never flaunted my wealth. I preferred to operate in the shadows, building my empire, quietly avoiding the spotlight DeAndre craved. 5 years ago, when DeAndre was drowning in debt and facing bankruptcy, I had stepped in. I did not hand him cash. I used my shadow company to orchestrate a silent bailout. I tapped the search bar on the portal and typed in DeAndre's name. A comprehensive file immediately populated on the screen. I opened the folder labeled Primary Liabilities. I selected the document detailing the luxury penthouse he currently occupied, the one he had just arrogantly ordered me to vacate. I then opened the corresponding file for his startup business loan, the massive injection of capital that had launched his self-made millionaire lifestyle. The screen loaded the final binding legal agreements for both assets. I stared at the glowing text in the dark cabin of my car. The bold black letters on the screen read clearly, "Sole creditor Apex Holdings." I tapped the corporate ownership structure for Apex Holdings, confirming what I already knew. The screen displayed the ownership split, 100% owned by Simone. DeAndre thought he was a king casting out a peasant. He had no idea that he was merely a tenant in my kingdom, living on borrowed time. He had just declared war on the very person who held the deed to his entire existence. I locked my phone, tossing it onto the passenger seat. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face in the dark. The game had just begun, and I was already winning. DeAndre was completely oblivious, but he would learn the truth. The morning sun crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting shadows across imported Italian marble floors. I stood inside the massive walk-in closet, placing my clothes into a single suitcase. The penthouse was a testament to the illusion DeAndre lived in. He believed his lifestyle brand paid for this architectural masterpiece in the sky. He had no idea his monthly rent was subsidized by a phantom investor. Me, I packed only my clothes, my laptop, and a few books. I left the expensive watches and designer jewelry DeAndre bought me sitting on velvet trays. They were bought with funds I indirectly provided through his business loans. They meant nothing. As I zipped the suitcase, the sharp chime of the front door keypad echoed through the quiet apartment. I froze. I had not given permission to enter. The building concierge was strictly instructed to announce all guests. DeAndre must have given out the master access code. A second later, the heavy door swung open, followed by loud voices. I stepped out of the bedroom. My footsteps were completely silent on the thick Persian rug. Standing in the living room were DeAndre's younger sister Kendra and her husband Trayvon. Kendra marched around the room, pointing at furniture. She carried a pristine Hermes bag. I bought that exact bag for her birthday last month, using a proxy shopper so DeAndre could take credit. She had cried and hugged him. Now she gestured dismissively at my space. Trevin trailed behind her, wearing a loud tracksuit and oversized sunglasses. He typed furiously on his phone, checking his cryptocurrency portfolio. Trevon loved to boast about his investments and call himself a visionary, even though his bank accounts were perpetually overdrawn. He lived his entire life pretending to be a self-made mogul, much like his brother-in-law. The sheer hypocrisy of these two standing in my home was palpable. "Oh, good you are awake," Kendra said as she finally noticed me. Her voice held none of the faux warmth she reserved for family dinners. Instead, it dripped with toxic arrogance learned directly from her mother. She crossed her arms and stared at me like I was an insect that needed to be squashed under her expensive designer heel. "DeAndre told us you would be packing up this morning. We just came by to make sure you do not take anything that belongs to him." Amused by her audacity, I remained perfectly calm. Everything in this room, from the sofa to the crystal chandelier, was purchased through the corporate account of Apex Holdings. I watched her performance with silent detachment. She had no idea she was standing in the center of my personal kingdom. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "I am only taking my clothes, Kendra," I replied. "That is what DeAndre said you would say," Kendra shot back. "But Camille is moving in next week and she absolutely loves this aesthetic. DeAndre wants you to leave all the furniture, electronics, kitchen appliances, everything. He said to consider it compensation for holding him back these past 5 years. He feels it is the least you can do after living here for free." I maintained my neutral expression, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing any emotional reaction. The absolute delusion was almost breathtaking. DeAndre was effectively stealing the furniture I had purchased for a penthouse I owned to furnish a life for his new fiancé. I looked at Kendra, taking in her smug expression. She genuinely believed her brother was a self-made titan and that I was a parasite finally being scraped off his back. I could have laughed. I could have pulled up the deed to the property right then and there. But I needed the trap to spring perfectly. I needed them to dig their hole as deep as possible. The trap had to be flawless. "If DeAndre wants the furniture, he can have it," I said, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. "I have no use for it anyway." Kendra let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Obviously, you have no use for it. Where are you going to put a custom sectional in whatever cramped little apartment you are moving into? Camille has excellent taste, and she actually belongs in a place like this. You should be grateful you even got to experience this luxury." Before I could respond, Trayvon finally looked up from his phone. He pushed his oversized sunglasses down his nose and looked at me with an expression of supreme irritation. "Listen, Simone," Trayvon said, waving his phone. "I do not care about the furniture or the drama between you and DeAndre. I have real money to manage. Crypto never sleeps, and the markets are highly volatile today. But what I do care about is that parking situation downstairs." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my icy demeanor. "What about the parking situation, Trayvon?" "You are parked in the VIP resident spot right by the private elevator," he complained, pacing across the marble floor. "DeAndre told me I could use that spot starting today since I am helping Camille move her things in. I just leased a brand new Porsche 911 and I am not leaving it in the visitor garage. People do not respect high-value assets. I need you to hand over your parking pass and the keys to your little sedan right now. I want you to move it out to the street immediately." I stared at him. He wanted me to move my reliable paid-off car out of my parking space so he could park a car he likely could not afford the monthly payments on. Trayvon was the epitome of fake wealth. He leveraged credit cards and took out terrible loans just to project an image of success. "You want my car keys?" I asked, clarifying his demand. "Yes," Trayvon huffed, holding out his hand. "Just give me the keys. I will move your car to the street for you. I do not have time to wait for you to drag your bags down there. Time is money, Simone. And frankly, your car is an eyesore anyway. It brings down property value." I looked at his outstretched hand. The entitlement was staggering. They were not just kicking me out of my own home. They were trying to humiliate me on my way out the door. They wanted to strip me of my dignity to leave me feeling defeated and broken. But I was not broken. I was a predator watching oblivious mice walk willingly into a trap. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the magnetic VIP parking pass. I bypassed his hand and placed the plastic card gently onto the glass coffee table. "You can have the parking pass, Trayvon," I said, my voice smooth. "But nobody drives my car except me. I will move it out of the spot when I leave." Trayvon rolled his eyes, snatching the pass off the table. "Whatever, just make it quick. I have important business calls to make and I need that spot before my meeting." Kendra walked over to the velvet sofa and ran her hand along the backrest. "Do not forget to leave the master keycard on the kitchen counter," she commanded, not looking at me. "DeAndre is having the locks reprogrammed this afternoon, but we do not need you trying to sneak back in to take things you cannot afford." "I will leave the keycard where DeAndre requested," I replied. I walked back into the master bedroom. I grabbed the handle of my small suitcase. It was incredibly light. I took one last look around the magnificent bedroom. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, a city I practically owned behind closed doors. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This eviction was the necessary catalyst for DeAndre's destruction. I walked down the hallway, the wheels of my suitcase gliding silently. Kendra and Trayvon were sitting on the sofa arguing about which expensive restaurant DeAndre would pay for later. They did not look up as I passed. They had already dismissed me, viewing me as a problem that had been permanently solved. I walked to the kitchen island, placing the master key card in the center of the marble counter. I walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind me. The lock clicked solidly into place. Riding the elevator to the garage, I pulled out my phone and drafted an encrypted message to my property attorney. The message was direct. "Execute the eviction protocols for the penthouse immediately. Serve the occupants with extreme prejudice." I hit send. Trayvon could enjoy his stolen VIP parking spot for just a few more days. By the end of this week, that leased Porsche would be towed away, and Kendra would be standing crying on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing. The silent countdown to their absolute and total destruction had officially begun. The silent countdown to their absolute and total destruction had officially begun. I settled into the driver's seat of my sedan, relishing the quiet isolation of the cabin. The engine hummed to life, a steady, reliable sound that contrasted sharply with the chaotic greed unfolding upstairs. I shifted the car into gear, ready to pull out of the parking garage, when my phone vibrated violently against the center console. The screen illuminated the dim interior, displaying a new text message from DeAndre. I picked up the device. He could not resist twisting the knife one final time. The message was brief, arrogant, and entirely predictable. "Consider it a management fee for dealing with you for 5 years. Do not beg." I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing slightly in confusion. A second notification dropped down from the top of my screen, this one an automated urgent alert from my personal banking application. It was a notice regarding the single joint checking account DeAndre and I shared. I tapped the alert, bypassing the lock screen. The balance, which had sat at exactly $20,000 just yesterday afternoon, now read 0. My jaw tightened. That specific account was never meant for daily expenses, shared bills, or luxury purchases. We had established it years ago for absolute emergencies, and I was the only one who ever deposited money into it. Just last week, I had transferred $20,000 of my own personal funds into that account to cover my mother's upcoming physical therapy and her out-of-pocket medical expenses. DeAndre knew exactly what that money was designated for. He knew my mother needed those funds by the end of the month to secure her specialized care. I scrolled through the transaction history, my eyes narrowing at the glowing screen. The money had not been transferred to another banking account. It had not been withdrawn as cash. It had been spent in a single massive transaction at a high-end boutique jeweler in the center of Buckhead. The jeweler specialized exclusively in custom engagement rings and bridal accessories. He had deliberately drained my mother's medical fund to purchase Camille's massive diamond ring. Any other woman would have shattered at this realization. Any other woman would have furiously dialed his number, screaming through the phone, demanding the money back and crying over the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the theft. I did not shed a single tear. I did not panic. I simply sat there in the quiet concrete garage, a cold, dark amusement washing over me. DeAndre actually believed he had left me destitute. He genuinely thought he had stripped me of my last dime, robbed my family of their medical security, and left me completely stranded on the streets of Atlanta. He had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. I tossed the phone back onto the passenger seat and pulled out of the garage, merging seamlessly onto the busy Atlanta streets. The morning sun glared off the towering glass facades of the corporate skyscrapers above me. Looking at those magnificent buildings, my mind drifted back to exactly where DeAndre had been 5 years ago. When I first met DeAndre, he was not the polished, arrogant CEO standing on brilliantly lit stages in custom-tailored suits. He was a desperate, drowning man. His previous business ventures had collapsed spectacularly due to gross mismanagement. He had maxed out every credit card to his name, defaulted on multiple car loans, and was facing imminent, crushing bankruptcy. He was living out of a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment, constantly dodging calls from aggressive collection agencies and complaining bitterly about how the world simply failed to recognize his unique visionary genius. I had loved him then. I believed in his potential even when the rest of the professional world saw him as a toxic financial liability, but I knew his pride was his most fragile and dangerous asset. DeAndre was a man governed entirely by his ego. If I had simply handed him a personal check to clear his massive debts, he would have resented me forever. He needed to believe he was conquering the world entirely on his own merit. He needed to feel like a conqueror. So I gave him exactly what he needed. I gave him a brilliant illusion. I was already working as a highly successful risk management analyst, but my true wealth came from aggressive anonymous investments in distressed commercial real estate. I had millions quietly generating compounding interest in offshore accounts and complex corporate structures. I used a fraction of that hidden wealth to create a bulletproof shadow entity, Apex Holdings. Through Apex Holdings, I silently purchased every single piece of DeAndre's outstanding debt. I bought his failed loans for pennies on the dollar from the exhausted collection agencies. Then, acting as a faceless elite corporate benefactor, Apex Holdings miraculously approved DeAndre for a massive uncollateralized startup business loan. The terms of the contract were practically giving the capital away, featuring heavily discounted interest rates that no legitimate regulated bank would ever offer a man with a ruined credit history. With that invisible influx of my personal cash, DeAndre launched his luxury lifestyle brand. He immediately adopted the persona of a brilliant self-made mogul. He bought into his own manufactured hype with terrifying speed. When he decided he needed a residence that properly matched his newly inflated social status, it was Apex Holdings that conveniently stepped in again. My shadow company purchased the multi-million-dollar penthouse in Buckhead and leased it to him at a fraction of the actual market value, bearing the subsidy in complex corporate accounting. For 5 years, I watched him parade around Atlanta, aggressively boasting about his incredible business acumen to anyone who would listen. I stood quietly in the background at elite networking events, wearing simple dresses, letting him introduce me as his sweet, supportive girlfriend, who worked a boring, conventional corporate job. He loved playing the role of the generous provider. He loved making me feel like I was incredibly lucky to be attached to such a powerful, financially successful man. He never knew that every single brick of his glittering empire rested squarely in the palm of my hand. He never knew that the anonymous corporate board he constantly bragged about securing funding from consisted of exactly one person: me. And now this manufactured titan of industry had the absolute audacity to steal $20,000 from his secret benefactor. He thought taking my mother's medical fund would ruin me completely. It was literal pocket change. I could easily replace the $20,000 with a single, instantaneous transfer from any of my minor dividend accounts without even noticing a dip in my overall net worth. The money itself was entirely irrelevant. What mattered was the profound disrespect. What mattered was the malicious intent behind the theft. He wanted to watch me suffer. He wanted to break me down to ensure I understood my miserable place at the absolute bottom of his imaginary social hierarchy. I gripped the leather steering wheel, navigating the heavy morning traffic with practiced ease. My mind was no longer focused on the sharp pain of his betrayal. My mind was entirely consumed by the exact legal mechanics of his impending ruin. He had sent a text message telling me to consider the stolen money a management fee. He explicitly told me not to beg. I would never beg. I would simply collect. DeAndre had fundamentally violated the core terms of his commercial loans by engaging in documented financial theft and publicly attempting to defame my character. The contracts I had drafted through my elite legal team 5 years ago were ironclad and utterly merciless. They contained specific, highly aggressive morality and default clauses that allowed the sole creditor to seize all corporate assets, freeze operational bank accounts, and demand immediate repayment of the principal balance upon any major breach of contract. He had built a luxury lifestyle brand entirely on the fragile concept of image, wealth, and prestige. I was going to strip every single layer of that carefully curated image away until there was nothing left but the bankrupt, desperate man I had pitied 5 years ago. I was going to dismantle his entire life with the exact same ruthless efficiency he had used to discard our relationship. I merged onto the downtown highway, heading directly toward the sleek, modern high-rise building that housed my true corporate operations. I did not drive to a cramped, run-down apartment complex like Kendra and Trevon gleefully assumed I would. I drove straight into the highly secured private underground parking garage of a commercial tower owned exclusively by my investment portfolio. I parked my modest sedan in the reserved executive bay and took the private keycard access elevator directly to the top floor. The heavy steel doors opened to a sprawling, immaculate office space featuring panoramic views of the city skyline. My dedicated legal team and senior wealth managers were already assembled in the main glass-walled conference room, waiting quietly for my arrival. They had received my encrypted directive regarding the residential eviction protocols earlier that morning, but they knew from the cold tone of my message that a much larger, far more destructive operation was about to commence. I walked into the conference room, placing my leather briefcase on the heavy mahogany table. The men and women in the room looked at me with strict professional deference. They did not see the quiet, unassuming girlfriend who had just been publicly dumped and humiliated. They saw the undisputed chairwoman of Apex Holdings. They saw a woman who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in regional assets. "Good morning, Simone," my lead attorney. Marcus greeted me respectfully, sliding a thick red-tabbed file across the polished table. "We received your early morning directive. The eviction notices for the residential penthouse are currently being processed by the Fulton County Civil Enforcement Division. They will be executed exactly as you outlined with no leniency." "That is just the beginning, Marcus," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. I opened the heavy file reviewing the massive financial exposure DeAndre currently maintained under our corporate umbrella. "I need you to initiate a total comprehensive asset freeze on all of his corporate accounts by the close of business today. I want the default clauses aggressively activated on his primary startup loans. He breached the morality clause this morning by engaging in verifiable financial theft from a joint banking account." Marcus nodded sharply, making a swift, decisive notation on his legal pad. "We can execute the absolute freeze immediately. He will not be able to process employee payroll, pay his external vendors, or access a single cent of liquid capital through the business. What is our legal stance on the remaining physical assets?" "Seize everything," I commanded, my voice echoing coldly in the pristine room. "I want immediate liens placed on all commercial property associated with his brand. I want the corporate vehicles grounded and secured. I want every single vendor notified that Apex Holdings is withdrawing all financial backing and calling in our debts. He wanted to play the role of the ruthless CEO. Let us show him what actual corporate ruthlessness looks like. The legal team immediately went to work, fingers flying across keyboards as they drafted the devastating legal notices that would permanently dismantle DeAndre's fake reality. I stood up from the table and walked over to the floor to ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. DeAndre was out there somewhere, likely laughing with Camille, feeling invincible, believing he had successfully discarded a heavy burden. He thought $20,000 was a management fee. He was about to learn that the true cost of managing me was everything he owned. He had told me not to beg. I smiled, watching the traffic flow like tiny ants far below my tower. I would not beg. But before this week was over, he certainly would. The financial chokehold was now firmly in place, and I was ready to slowly tighten the grip. The financial chokehold was now firmly in place, and I was ready to slowly tighten the grip. I turned away from the sprawling Atlanta skyline and walked back toward the massive mahogany table in the center of the conference room. Marcus, my lead attorney, tapped his sleek tablet, bringing up a secure encrypted live feed on the digital display mounted to the wall. The camera angle showed the private elevator lobby directly outside the penthouse I had just vacated. I paused, my eyes locking onto the high-definition screen. When I left earlier, I had purposely abandoned a small secondary suitcase near the foyer. It contained old, meaningless items, a final test to see exactly how petty DeAndre's family truly was. The heavy mahogany door of the penthouse swung open. Kendra stepped into the pristine hallway, her face contorted into a nasty, triumphant sneer. She spotted the small suitcase resting against the expensive wallpaper. Without a single moment of hesitation, she pulled back her designer heel and kicked the bag violently out into the corridor. The suitcase skidded across the marble floor, hitting the far wall with a muted thud. Kendra laughed, a cruel, echoing sound picked up by the hidden microphone before slamming the penthouse door shut. I stood in my immaculate corporate office watching the discarded suitcase lie alone in the empty hallway. A normal person might have felt a sharp sting of humiliation. A normal person might have marched right back up to that floor to demand basic respect. I did not move a single muscle. I did not send a courier to pick the bag up. It was entirely worthless to me, much like the people currently occupying my property. Instead, I reached across the polished conference table and picked up the secure, encrypted landline phone that connected directly to my personal wealth management lawyer, a man who handled the most vicious aspects of my corporate enforcements. Marcus watched me with quiet intensity as I dialed the private extension. The line clicked, and a deep, professional voice answered immediately. I did not bother with pleasantries. The time for silent observation was permanently over. The time for absolute destruction had arrived. Initiate the final phase of the default clauses on DeAndre's primary business loans. I ordered, my voice ringing out cold and sharp in the quiet room. I want every single line of credit completely severed by noon. I want his corporate expense accounts frozen, and I want the immediate recall of the master capital injection we provided 5 years ago. He has 72 hours to produce the full repayment of the principal balance, or we seize his entire operational infrastructure. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line as my lawyer processed the aggressive timeline. We can execute that immediately, Simone, he replied smoothly. But calling in the principal balance will instantly trigger a massive liquidity crisis for his brand. He will not even be able to cover his basic overhead costs by tomorrow morning. That is exactly the point, I stated, my eyes still fixed on the paused security footage of Kendra's arrogant smirk. He built a lifestyle brand on the illusion of limitless wealth. I want that illusion shattered. Let him try to pay his high-end vendors with an overdrawn account. Let him try to explain to Camille why his elite corporate credit cards are suddenly declining at the jewelry store. I paced slowly across the length of the conference room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. But we are not stopping at the business accounts. I want you to issue a formal, legally binding eviction notice for the luxury penthouse. And I do not want the standard 30-day grace period. Draft a 72-hour emergency vacate order based on a hostile breach of the primary lease agreement. My wealth management lawyer chuckled softly. A 72-hour eviction is incredibly aggressive. They will barely have time to pack their luxury clothes, let alone find a comparable residence. They will be carrying their items out in trash bags. Make sure the eviction notice is plastered directly to the front door of the penthouse, I instructed, feeling a cold surge of satisfaction. I want the building management to escort the process servers up the private elevator. I want Kendra, Trevon, and DeAndre to realize simultaneously that the home they are currently claiming does not belong to them. They wanted to kick my belongings out into the hallway. They will soon find themselves standing on the actual street with absolutely nowhere to go. We will have the eviction notice served within the hour, the lawyer confirmed. The local authorities will be notified to enforce the vacate order exactly 3 days from today. Is there anything else regarding the extended family assets? I stopped pacing and looked back out the window. My mind shifted from DeAndre and his entitled sister to the true architect of their toxic arrogance, Vivian. DeAndre's mother had cornered me at the restaurant, gleefully mocking my clothes, my background, and my financial status. She had loudly declared that I lacked the pedigree to associate with their elite social circle. Vivian spent her entire life desperately clawing her way into Atlanta's upper echelon, using her son's fake wealth to buy her way into prestigious country clubs and exclusive charity boards. She thrived on public perception. Her entire self-worth was tied to her manufactured social standing. I smiled a sharp, dangerous expression that caused Marcus to raise an eyebrow. "There is one final directive," I said into the phone, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper. "I want you to look into the secondary collateral loans we hold under Vivian's name." DeAndre used his business credit to co-sign a massive line of debt for his mother, so she could maintain her lavish lifestyle. Since DeAndre is now in total default, Vivian's collateral loans are immediately due. "I have her files right here." The lawyer noted the sound of keyboard clicking echoing over the line. "She owes nearly $400,000 in secondary debt. She has been using the funds to pay her exorbitant country club dues and finance her luxury vehicle fleet. Draft the official debt collection notice for the full $400,000, I commanded. But do not mail it to her home address. Do not send it to her email. I want this handled with a very specific, highly visible touch." I walked back to the table, leaning forward, bracing my hands against the smooth wood. Vivian is playing in the annual charity golf tournament at the Buckhead Elite Country Club this afternoon. It is their most prestigious event of the year. Every major politician, socialite, and wealthy social climber in Atlanta will be standing on the green. She has been bragging about this tournament for 6 straight months. I understand, the lawyer said, a hint of dark amusement entering his professional tone. "You want her served in person." "I want the process server to walk straight onto the perfectly manicured grass of the 18th hole," I ordered, my voice trembling with suppressed adrenaline. "I want the server to approach Vivian right in the middle of her final swing. I want the legal documents detailing her massive, crippling debt handed directly to her in front of every single wealthy friend she has ever tried to impress. I want them all to see the official corporate seals. I want them to know that her entire life is a fraud financed by unpaid loans. Make sure the server speaks loudly enough for the entire gallery to hear exactly why she is being served." "Consider it done, Simone," the lawyer promised. "The server will be dispatched to the country club immediately. Vivian will be holding the default notice before she even reaches the clubhouse." I hung up the phone, the satisfying click echoing loudly through the quiet conference room. I looked over at Marcus, who was already finalizing the digital paperwork for the massive corporate freeze. The machinery of absolute ruin was now moving at maximum speed. There was no reversing the damage. DeAndre had spent 5 years treating me like a stepping stone, a pathetic little woman he could easily discard the moment he found a shinier, wealthier prize. He had paraded his new fiancée in front of me, allowing his mother and sister to mock my existence, assuming I would simply crawl away into the shadows and cry. They believed they held all the power because they wore designer labels and drank expensive champagne. They did not understand that real power does not need to announce itself. Real power operates in absolute silence until it is time to strike. And my strike was going to be utterly devastating. I sat down in my luxurious leather chair, smoothing out the fabric of my skirt. I pulled up a secondary screen on the conference room monitor, linking directly into the internal banking ledger for DeAndre's lifestyle brand. I watched the green numbers displaying his corporate cash flow suddenly blink freeze and turn a glaring aggressive red. The accounts were officially locked. The financial oxygen had been entirely cut off. In less than an hour, DeAndre's credit cards would begin declining. In less than 2 hours, a massive eviction notice would be taped to the front door of his pristine penthouse. And by early afternoon, his arrogant mother would be publicly humiliated on the 18th hole of her beloved country club, exposed as a fraud in front of her entire social circle. I leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and took a slow, deep breath. The pathetic practical girlfriend was dead. The invisible billionaire had finally arrived, and she was going to burn their fake empire straight to the ground. Across town, DeAndre remained blissfully unaware of the financial guillotine tightening around his neck. He was sitting in the plush lounge of the exclusive country club Camille favored, nursing a hangover masked by expensive sunglasses. His ego, however, was incredibly fragile. Despite his arrogant dismissal of me the night before, a nagging paranoia gnawed at his mind. He knew I possessed intimate knowledge of his early business struggles, the messy details he carefully kept hidden. He could not simply let me walk away with all those destructive, deeply personal corporate secrets floating around inside my quiet, dangerously observant human brain. He convinced himself that I was a ticking time bomb, a scorned woman preparing to storm his pristine office and shatter his carefully curated image. DeAndre decided he could not wait for me to quietly fade away. He needed to completely neutralize me before I could ever pose a threat to his new glamorous lifestyle. He needed to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that no one in Atlanta would ever believe a word I said. He turned to the woman sitting beside him. Camille was scrolling through wedding venues on her phone, entirely oblivious to his frantic rising internal panic. "Camille, babe," DeAndre murmured, leaning close to her ear. "I need a massive favor. My crazy ex is trying to extort me. She is threatening to release fake documents to ruin my brand. I need to handle her before she causes a public scene." Camille immediately stopped scrolling, her eyes narrowing with malicious interest. She possessed a vast network of affluent, powerful connections throughout the city, a web of wealthy elites who traded favors like currency. "Who does she work for?" Camille asked, her voice dripping with cold venom. "Vanguard Risk Management," DeAndre replied, naming the prominent local corporate firm. Camille smiled a predatory, wicked smile. "My uncle plays golf with the senior managing partner at Vanguard," she purred, opening her contacts. "What exactly do you want him to know?" DeAndre worked quickly, fabricating a lie so toxic it would ensure my immediate termination and permanent blacklisting. "Tell him she has been aggressively stealing highly confidential client financial data," he lied smoothly. "Tell him she is secretly funneling restricted corporate portfolios to offshore competitors. Tell him I found the flash drives in her bag and kicked her out because I refused to associate with a known corporate data-stealing criminal." It was a brilliantly vicious strategy. In the high-stakes world of risk management, an accusation of data theft was an absolute death sentence. It would trigger an immediate internal investigation, freeze all my credentials, and guarantee my termination before I could even defend myself. Camille made the phone call immediately, her voice dripping with faux concern, as she relayed the fabricated warning to her powerful uncle. DeAndre sat back against the leather cushions, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He believed he had just delivered the fatal, crushing blow to my entirely mediocre, insignificant corporate working existence. While DeAndre was busy orchestrating my fake demise, I was sitting quietly at my designated cubicle inside the Vanguard Risk Management headquarters. The cubicle was small, cramped, and positioned in the least desirable corner of the massive analytics department. It was the perfect, unassuming cover. The regular employees saw me as a quiet, dedicated analyst who kept her head down and never caused trouble. They had no idea that I held a controlling interest in the private equity firm that owned Vanguard, or that the building we were currently sitting in was registered directly to my primary offshore holding company. I was reviewing a complex leveraged buyout strategy on my monitor when the internal communication system chimed loudly. A message flashed across the screen from the Human Resources Department. It was a formal, highly urgent summons. Simone, please report to the office of the director immediately. Bring your employee badge and company access keys. The wording was distinct and uncompromising. It was the exact protocol Vanguard utilized for immediate hostile terminations. I stared at the message, a slow, dark amusement washing over me. DeAndre had actually taken the bait faster than I had originally anticipated. He was remarkably wonderfully predictable. Just as I pushed my chair back from the desk, my personal phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from DeAndre. The timing was perfectly coordinated. "Check your email, you pathetic loser," the text read. "You should have kept your mouth shut and left quietly. I told you not to mess with my legacy. Camille and her family run this entire city. Good luck paying rent when you are blacklisted from every corporate firm in Atlanta. Do not bother begging me for a reference. Consider this a permanent, brutal professional learning lesson." I read the text twice, savoring the sheer magnitude of his blind arrogance. He was boasting about using his new wealthy connections to destroy my life, entirely unaware that he was throwing rocks at a bulletproof fortress. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I did not gather my personal belongings from the cubicle. I simply grabbed my employee badge, smoothed the front of my tailored skirt, and began the long walk toward the executive suites. The analytics floor was buzzing with hushed whispers as I confidently walked straight forward, passing numerous crowded active working stations. News of a hostile termination always traveled rapidly. My colleagues shot me looks of pity and hidden curiosity, assuming I was being escorted to the corporate guillotine. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, my posture straight and commanding. I reached the heavy glass doors of the Human Resources Department. The receptionist looked up, her expression strained and apologetic. She pointed silently toward the massive corner office belonging to Marcus Sterling, the ruthless director of human resources. Marcus was notoriously strict, a man who terminated executives without a second thought. He was also completely aware of my true corporate identity today. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the spacious office. Marcus was sitting behind his expansive desk, looking incredibly stressed. His tie was loosened and he was rubbing his temples with both hands. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, he immediately jumped to his feet, his chair rolling back sharply against the wall. He did not look like a corporate executioner preparing to fire a junior-level analyst. He looked like a man who had just been handed a live grenade and had absolutely no idea how to safely disarm the situation. "Simone, thank God you are here," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. He quickly crossed the room and closed the blinds on the glass walls, ensuring absolute privacy. "We have a massive situation unfolding. I just received a direct, frantic phone call from the senior managing partner. Apparently, a highly influential contact reached out to him with some extremely aggressive allegations regarding your employment here. They are claiming you have been actively stealing sensitive client data and funneling it to offshore accounts. The partner is demanding an immediate, thorough internal investigation and your provisional unpaid employment suspension." I walked over to the plush leather guest chair and took a seat, crossing my legs elegantly. "I know exactly where the rumors originated, Marcus," I said, my voice calm and authoritative. "DeAndre engineered this attack using his new fiancée and her uncle. He is attempting a preemptive strike because he believes I am a threat to his public image. He wants me fired and publicly discredited." Marcus stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "He wants you fired," Marcus repeated, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Does this idiot have absolutely any idea who you actually are?" "He believes I am just a mediocre analyst struggling to pay rent," I replied, allowing a cold smile to touch my lips. "He thinks he is flexing immense power by using social connections to crush my career." Marcus let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "He just attempted to blacklist the majority shareholder of the firm. The senior partner was screaming at me to confiscate your badge and escort you off the premises. If I tell him the truth about your ownership status, he is going to have an absolute heart attack right there on the golf course." "Do not tell the partner anything just yet," I instructed, leaning forward and resting my hands on the desk. Let DeAndre believe his pathetic little sabotage mission was a complete success. I want him to feel utterly invincible for the next few hours. Let him celebrate my fake termination with Camille. Send a formal, standard automated email to my corporate address officially suspending me pending a severe data theft investigation. Make sure it looks completely legitimate. When his financial world entirely collapses this afternoon, the absolute shock will be infinitely more devastating if he thinks he has already finally won. The heavy oak door of the Human Resources office suddenly swung open, hitting the wall with a loud bang that made Marcus jump. Richard Vance, the senior managing partner of Vanguard Risk Management, stormed into the room. His face was flushed with anger and he was clutching a thick, freshly printed termination folder. Richard was a man who prided himself on his golf club connections and elite social standing. He had no idea about the confidential restructuring Marcus and I had been discussing. To Richard, I was nothing more than an expendable data analyst who had just deeply embarrassed him in front of his wealthy country club associates. Marcus tried to intervene, raising his hands defensively. Richard, we are currently handling the situation internally. I am speaking with Simone right now to get her side of the story. There is no side of the story to get Marcus. Richard snapped, stepping past him and throwing the termination folder violently onto the center of the desk. I just got off the phone with an incredibly important contact. This employee has been aggressively stealing highly confidential client financial data. She has been secretly funneling restricted corporate portfolios to offshore competitors. My source found stolen flash drives in her personal bag. She is a liability, a criminal, and a complete disgrace to this firm. I sat perfectly still in the plush leather guest chair, maintaining a calm, unreadable expression. I did not flinch. I did not interrupt. I simply watched Richard posture and fume, letting him dig his professional grave with every arrogant word. DeAndre and Camille had truly outdone themselves with the sheer magnitude of their fabricated lies. They knew exactly which buttons to push to send a man like Richard into a blind reactionary panic. You are terminated immediately, Simone, Richard declared, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. You will surrender your badge, your access keys, and your company phone right this second. Security is waiting outside to escort you off the premises. We will be filing criminal charges for corporate espionage before the day is over. You will never work in the financial sector of Atlanta again. I slowly crossed my legs, smoothing the fabric of my tailored skirt. I looked at the termination folder resting on the desk, then shifted my gaze back to Richard. His chest was heaving. He looked incredibly proud of himself, thoroughly convinced he had just protected his precious firm from a massive security breach. Are you quite finished, Richard? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a lethal authority that caused him to blink in confusion. Excuse me, he barked, his face turning a darker shade of red. You do not get to take that tone with me. You are a fired employee facing severe felony charges. I calmly reached down and picked up my slim black leather briefcase from the floor. I placed it on my lap, the metallic click of the locks echoing sharply in the tense silence of the office. I opened the lid and pulled out a thick, legally bound document secured in a heavy black folder. I did not hand it to him. I tossed it across the polished mahogany desk. It slid smoothly, stopping right on top of his ridiculous termination paperwork. Write it, I commanded. Richard scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. I am not reading your pathetic excuses or some meaningless legal threat. You are done here. I suggest you read it, Richard Marcus interjected quietly from the corner of the room. His voice entirely drained of its previous panic. He watched me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Richard glared at Marcus, then looked down at the document. He snatched it up, flipping open the heavy black cover with aggressive force. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the initial arrogance fade into confusion. Then, as he read the secondary clauses and the finalized signature lines, all the color completely drained from his face. His hands began to shake visibly, the expensive paper trembling in his grip. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and suddenly realized there was no ground beneath him. This, Richard stammered, his voice cracking into a high, breathless wheeze. "This is a complete corporate acquisition contract." "That is correct," I replied, standing up slowly from the leather chair. I smoothed my jacket, asserting my physical presence in the room. 3 months ago, a private equity firm initiated a highly aggressive, deeply classified, leveraged buyout of Vanguard Risk Management. We purchased every single outstanding share, absorbed your massive operational debts, and completely restructured the executive hierarchy. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the contract and my face. "But this states that Apex Holdings is the sole proprietor. The acquiring entity is a shadow corporation. We never knew who the actual buyers were. The board just approved the capital injection to save the firm from bankruptcy." I walked slowly around the desk, stopping just inches from where Richard stood paralyzed. "I am Apex Holdings Richard. I am the sole proprietor. I am the shadow chairwoman of the board. I did not just work here as a low-level data analyst. I own the building you are standing in. I own the chair you are sitting on. I own your employment contract, your corporate pension, and your entire professional future." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Richard looked as though he might physically collapse. The man who had stormed into the office demanding my immediate destruction was now trembling before his undisputed corporate master. He looked down at the termination folder he had thrown on the desk, realizing he had just attempted to fire the billionaire owner of his entire company. But the phone call, Richard whispered, his voice stripped of all its former aggressive pride. "The allegations about the stolen data. Camille's uncle said he had proof. He said you were a criminal. He lied to you, Richard." I stated, my tone merciless and cold. "You allowed a country club rumor to override basic corporate protocol. You breached fundamental internal investigation guidelines because you wanted to impress a wealthy friend. You threatened me with criminal charges without reviewing a single shred of actual verifiable evidence." "I am so sorry, miss," he stammered, stepping backward, putting distance between us. "I had absolutely no idea. I was just trying to protect the firm. I thought I was doing the right thing." "You were being a reckless, easily manipulated fool," I corrected sharply. "But your profound incompetence is a secondary issue right now. The primary issue is the man who engineered this pathetic, desperate attack." I turned away from Richard and focused entirely on Marcus, who was already pulling up his secure digital legal portal. The time for setting traps was officially over. The time for total retaliation had commenced. DeAndre wanted to play corporate warfare. I was going to show him exactly what it meant to face a fully mobilized legal army. "Marcus," I said, pacing slowly across the length of the office. "DeAndre just engaged in deliberate, malicious corporate sabotage. He utilized external connections to fabricate severe felony allegations in a coordinated attempt to destroy my professional livelihood. He tried to trigger a false federal investigation into my data handling protocols." "Yes, Chairwoman," Marcus responded, using my formal title for the first time, his fingers flying across the glowing keyboard. "The liability exposure for his actions is catastrophic. Launch an immediate massive corporate defamation lawsuit against DeAndre's luxury lifestyle brand," I ordered, my voice ringing with lethal precision. "I do not want a standard cease and desist warning. I want a full-scale, multi-million-dollar litigation filed in the Fulton County Superior Court before the courthouse closes today. Sue him for tortious interference with business relations, malicious defamation, and aggressive corporate libel." Marcus nodded sharply, documenting every single directive. "We will request an emergency injunction and demand immediate financial damages. The sheer scale of the lawsuit will force his brand into public receivership. I want the lawsuit specifically structured to target his corporate entity, and him personally." I continued, stopping by the window to look out over the city. "I want his remaining personal assets tied directly into the litigation. He bragged in his text message about blacklisting me in Atlanta. I want every single vendor, investor, and business partner associated with his brand formally subpoenaed as part of our discovery process. I want them legally forced to turn over all communications regarding his operations." Richard stood silently in the corner, watching the terrifying efficiency of the counterattack. He was witnessing firsthand the absolute destruction of a man who thought he could outsmart a shadow billionaire. When the media gets hold of the lawsuit, his entire lifestyle brand will become toxic overnight, Marcus noted, pulling up the necessary legal templates. His fragile empire will crumble into nothing. He loses it all. I left Richard and Marcus in the office, the heavy oak door closing with a satisfying click. The air in the executive corridor felt crisper, lighter, completely purged of the toxic arrogance that had polluted it just moments ago. The wheels of absolute destruction were already in motion, tearing through the fragile fabric of DeAndre's fake reality with terrifying speed. I had authorized a multi-million-dollar corporate defamation lawsuit that would bury him, but my day was far from over. I rode the private elevator down to the secured underground garage, my mind effortlessly shifting from merciless corporate litigation to regional expansion strategies. My driver was waiting patiently beside my sleek black town car. I slid into the quiet back seat, instructing him to head directly to the Luminary. It was an ultra-exclusive, ridiculously expensive restaurant situated right in the heart of Buckhead. I had scheduled an executive meeting in their private VIP dining room to finalize the aggressive acquisition of 3 competing commercial banking branches. The drive through Atlanta traffic provided a brief moment of reflection. I watched the towering skyscrapers pass by my window, knowing that somewhere up in those glass towers, process servers were currently marching toward DeAndre's office and his penthouse. The Luminary was a fortress of modern luxury, designed to cater to the city's most affluent, status-obsessed elite. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the wealthy shopping district. When I stepped through the brass doors and into the grand marble lobby, I immediately noticed an obnoxious display of pink and gold floral arrangements, completely choking the main event hall. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved frantically through the crowd, carrying heavy silver trays stacked high with vintage champagne flutes. A massive ice sculpture shaped like a diamond engagement ring dominated the center of the room, slowly melting under the bright spotlight. The entire scene was loud, ostentatious, and desperate. I walked toward the host stand, intending to bypass the gaudy spectacle and head straight for my reserved private room. Then a piercing voice echoed across the expansive marble foyer, cutting directly through the jazz music playing softly overhead. It was a voice dripping with toxic superiority and desperate entitlement. "Well, look what the cat dragged in from the clearance rack." I stopped in my tracks. I turned slowly, my expression blank and my posture rigid. Vivian was marching across the lobby, a crystal glass of pink champagne, sloshing dangerously in her heavily manicured hand. She wore a ridiculously oversized designer hat and a silk dress that practically screamed newly acquired credit card debt. Behind her, the massive bridal shower was in full swing. Camille sat at a plush velvet throne surrounded by Atlanta's elite socialites, blissfully ignorant of the financial apocalypse rapidly descending upon her new fiancé. Vivian closed the distance between us with aggressive strides, bringing the suffocating scent of heavy designer perfume with her. Several wealthy women from the shower turned their heads toward the lobby, their eyes glittering with the promise of high society drama. Vivian absolutely lived for these exact moments. She thrived on tearing other women down in public spaces to artificially elevate her own fragile status. "Are you actually stalking us now, Simone?" Vivian demanded, her voice deliberately raised so her affluent friends could hear every single word. "Did you follow us here to beg for a pathetic handout? This is a private, highly exclusive event for Camille and Atlanta's absolute finest families. We do not allow bitter, discarded ex-girlfriends to crash our elegant celebrations." I stood perfectly still, my briefcase held firmly in my right hand. I did not shrink under her aggressive glare. I did not blush or look away in shame. I merely observed her with the cold, detached interest of a scientist studying a particularly noisy insect. "I have a private business meeting, Vivian," I stated evenly, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. "I have absolutely zero interest in your little party." Vivian laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed sharply off the polished marble walls of the lobby. "A business meeting? What are you organizing a carpool for your miserable little office job? Do not make me laugh. You are just pathetic, Simone." You saw my son DeAndre stepping up in the world, securing a woman from a real family with generational wealth, and you just could not handle the rejection. You honestly thought you could cling to him forever and leech off his incredible success. She stepped even closer, thrusting a long acrylic fingernail directly at the center of my chest. Let me make this clear for you right now, so you finally understand your place. DeAndre is marrying into absolute prestige. He is a brilliant self-made mogul, and Camille brings genuine high society status to our family legacy. You are nothing but a boring, broke, low-level employee who could never appreciate his genius. Stay far away from my son, and stay far away from our wealth. We are entirely out of your league, and you need to accept that you lost. The restaurant lobby went deathly quiet. The busy waiters stopped moving, holding their silver trays still. The wealthy socialites stared eagerly from the dining hall, waiting for me to shatter into pieces and run crying out the front door in total humiliation. Vivian stood exceptionally tall, her chest puffed out with arrogant pride, reveling in her perceived victory. She genuinely believed she had just put me in my miserable, impoverished place. I looked at the aggressive pointing finger hovering near my jacket. I looked at the smug, arrogant smile plastered across her heavily contoured face. Then I closed the remaining physical distance between us. I stepped directly into her personal space, violating her comfort zone with a sudden calculating movement. Vivian flinched slightly, her eyes widening in momentary shock as I reached out with my free hand. I did not slap her. I did not yell or raise my voice. I simply raised my hand and gently, methodically straightened the ruffled collar of her silk dress. I leaned in incredibly close, my lips hovering right next to her ear. "You talk about immense wealth, Vivian," I whispered, my voice, a cold blade slicing directly into her arrogant soul. "You brag loudly about this $200,000 bridal shower, but you and I both know you do not actually have the liquid capital to afford a single petal of those pink roses." I felt Vivian freeze instantly. Her entire body went rigidly stiff beneath my hands. Her breathing hitched sharply in her throat. "I know exactly how you paid for this desperate spectacle." I continued, my whisper dropping an octave, slipping seamlessly into the dark tone I reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. "I know that exactly 3 weeks ago, you quietly approached a private shadow lender because every legitimate bank in Georgia flatly denied your desperate loan applications. I know you secretly took out a massive second mortgage on your primary residence to fund this pathetic illusion of social grandeur." Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. Her pink champagne glass trembled violently in her rigid hand. A single drop of sweet liquid spilled over the crystal rim, landing silently on the pristine marble floor. "You thought the lender was just some invisible corporate entity?" I murmured, smoothing my hands down the lapels of her dress, patting her shoulders like a disappointed parent. "You were so eager for the cash that you never bothered to look past the shell company name printed on the loan documents. If you had retained a competent lawyer, you would have realized that the firm holding the secret mortgage on your house is Apex Holdings." Vivian gasped a sharp, ragged intake of air. Her eyes bulged with absolute terror. She stared at me, the fake confidence draining from her heavily made-up face. "I own Apex Holdings, Vivian," I stated, staring dead into her terrified eyes. "I own the mortgage on your house. I financed this ridiculous bridal shower. Since your son is currently in total default on all his corporate loans, I am activating the cross-collateral clauses on your personal debt right now." I stepped back, giving her space to fully absorb the impending reality of her financial ruin. I offered her a chillingly polite smile. "Just a friendly reminder," I said, my voice returning to a conversational volume so the watching socialites could hear every word. "The penalty interest rates on your secret mortgage begin accruing this Monday morning. I suggest you stop drinking champagne and start packing your bags immediately. Your house belongs to me now." I turned away from her paralyzed form. I did not look back as I walked elegantly toward the VIP dining room. Behind me, the sound of a shattering crystal glass echoed sharply through the lobby as Vivian collapsed into a cold sweat. The sound of that shattering crystal was the perfect overture to the symphony of destruction I had orchestrated. 3 days later, the financial guillotine finally dropped on DeAndre. He was sitting inside his sprawling glass-enclosed corner office, staring at a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices. The wedding was merely 72 hours away, and the mounting pressure was beginning to severely crack his meticulously curated billionaire facade. His phone had been ringing incessantly all morning with hysterical calls from his mother, which he arrogantly sent straight to voicemail. He assumed Vivian was just complaining about floral arrangements yet again. He had absolutely no idea that Vivian was currently packing her belongings in a blind panic, terrified of the impending foreclosure. DeAndre poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, trying to calm his fraying nerves. He adjusted his custom silk tie and looked out over the Atlanta skyline, convincing himself that once he married Camille, her family wealth would instantly solve all his hidden liquidity issues. He just needed to survive the next 3 days without anyone discovering that his entire luxury lifestyle brand was completely hollow. A sharp knock on his heavy frosted glass door interrupted his delusional daydreaming. His executive assistant stepped nervously into the office holding a thick, legally sealed envelope. She looked incredibly pale, clutching a digital delivery tablet against her chest. "A courier just dropped this off directly from the Fulton County Superior Court," she stammered, her voice shaking with obvious apprehension. "They bypassed the standard mailroom completely and demanded a direct, immediate signature." DeAndre snatched the heavy envelope from her trembling hands, flashing her a look of intense annoyance. Dismissing her with a sharp wave of his hand, he tore open the thick seal, fully expecting another trivial nuisance or minor vendor payment dispute. The stark, aggressive legal header stamped across the first page immediately drained the color from his face. It was a formal, expedited notice from Apex Holdings, the primary financial entity holding the massive commercial notes on his entire brand. DeAndre scanned the dense legal jargon, his heart suddenly hammering violently against his ribs. The document was a devastating, uncompromising margin call. Due to his egregious breach of standard corporate morality clauses and the newly filed multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit, Apex Holdings was officially calling in his entire $2.5 million business loan, effective immediately starting today. The room started to spin rapidly. The bold black text outlined the catastrophic consequences of his immediate default. If the total balance of $2.5 million was not wired into the specified Apex Holding account within 48 hours, the Shadow Corporation would legally seize his entire brand. They would immediately liquidate his corporate assets, seize his commercial real estate leases, and take permanent ownership of all his intellectual property. DeAndre dropped the documents onto his desk, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The walls of his pristine, glamorous office suddenly felt like a shrinking cage. This was completely impossible. He did not have $2 million. He did not even have $200,000 in liquid capital. He had drained his corporate operating accounts to fund his lavish engagement parties, exotic vacations, and the down payment on his luxury penthouse. The defamation lawsuit I had initiated earlier in the week had triggered an automatic default protocol hidden deep within his loan agreements. He frantically grabbed his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the contact number listed at the bottom of the aggressive legal notice. He needed to stop this immediately. The call was instantly routed to a cold, highly automated corporate switchboard. DeAndre bypassed the menus, frantically pounding the keypad until he reached a live legal representative. "I need to speak with the chairman of Apex Holdings. Right this second," DeAndre shouted into the receiver, pacing wildly across his expensive rug. "This notice is a complete misunderstanding. You cannot instantly call in a loan of this magnitude without a standard review period." The legal representative responded with a chillingly calm, robotic tone. "The chairman is entirely unavailable to speak with you today. Your contract explicitly waives all standard review periods." "Listen to me, you mediocre desk jockey," DeAndre growled, his voice rising in sheer, unadulterated panic. "I am marrying into the wealthiest family in this entire state. I am a highly influential public figure. You put the chairman on the line right now, or I will ensure you are fired by the end of the day." The representative did not flinch. The chairman issued a direct, personal mandate regarding your file, sir. Apex Holdings has zero interest in your upcoming marriage or your social status. We require the full transfer of funds within 48 hours. Goodbye, Mr. DeAndre Vance. The line went dead. DeAndre stared at his phone, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He tried calling his primary banking contacts, desperate to secure an emergency bridge loan to temporarily cover the massive Apex margin call. Every single bank flatly rejected him. News of the massive defamation lawsuit and the impending Apex asset seizure had already flooded the internal financial networks of Atlanta. He was officially categorized as completely toxic. No legitimate financial institution would touch him. His supposed billionaire facade was rapidly disintegrating, leaving a terrified, entirely broke imposter standing in the expensive, collapsing corporate wreckage. Just as his internal panic reached a fever pitch, his private cell phone chimed brightly. It was a text message from Camille. She was at the wedding venue, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial bomb that had just detonated in her fiancé's office. "The florist needs an additional $40,000 by tonight to upgrade the centerpieces," her message read, accompanied by a glittering diamond emoji. "Wire it over quickly, babe. Cannot wait for Saturday." DeAndre stared at the message, feeling physically nauseous. He could not tell her the truth. If Camille discovered he was completely bankrupt, she would vanish. Her elite family would cancel the extravagant wedding immediately, and he would become a public laughingstock throughout the entire city. He had to maintain the illusion of infinite wealth no matter the cost. He needed cash immediately, and he needed it from sources that did not check corporate credit scores or care about pending defamation lawsuits. He opened a hidden, encrypted messaging application on his phone. It was a network he had sworn he would never use again, a dark remnant from his earliest, most desperate days, trying to establish his initial business before he originally met me years ago. DeAndre typed out a frantic message to a man known only as Silas. Silas operated a brutal underground lending syndicate that catered exclusively to desperate high-risk individuals who had exhausted all legal financial avenues. Silas charged exorbitant predatory interest rates and utilized highly dangerous, physically intimidating collection methods. DeAndre knew exactly how ruthless these shadow lenders could be, but his blinding arrogance convinced him he could easily outsmart them. He just needed their cash to survive the wedding weekend. Once he was officially married to Camille, he could quietly siphon her family funds to pay off the underground debt. The response from Silas was immediate and incredibly cold. "Meet me at the warehouse district tonight. Bring your remaining asset portfolios." DeAndre swallowed the rising bile in his throat. He printed out the last remaining clean deeds to his business properties and his vehicles. He locked them inside his leather briefcase, the exact same briefcase he had used to confidently dismiss me just days earlier. He slipped out the back entrance of his corporate building, completely avoiding his assistant and the questioning stares of his remaining staff. He drove his sports car toward the neglected industrial edge of the city. The warehouse was dark, extremely damp, and smelled strongly of rusted metal and old engine oil. Silas sat behind a battered metal desk, flanked by two incredibly large, heavily armed men. Silas did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He simply slid a thick, single-page contract across the rusted metal surface. $3 million, Silas stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The interest rate is 40% compounding weekly. You default on this single payment and we do not seize your corporate assets. We take absolutely everything else. Sign the paper, Vance, or walk away now." DeAndre hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The vivid image of Camille canceling the wedding, the terrifying thought of losing his newly acquired social status, and the crushing reality of my incoming defamation lawsuit pushed him completely over the dangerous edge of reason. He picked up the cheap plastic pen resting on the metal desk and hastily scribbled his signature across the bottom line. He traded his actual safety for a temporary, fragile illusion. DeAndre grabbed the heavy duffel bag of transferred cash, totally unaware that his desperate, foolish spiral was playing perfectly into my ultimate master plan. The heavy duffel bag of transferred cash sat on the passenger seat of DeAndre's sports car, a physical manifestation of his imminent doom. He drove back toward the glittering Atlanta skyline, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. The $3 million in dirty money was supposed to represent his ultimate salvation, the financial bridge that would safely carry him down the wedding aisle and into Camille's generational wealth. Instead, the canvas bag felt like a ticking bomb resting right beside him. As soon as he returned to his penthouse, he began frantically distributing the funds. He immediately wired the requested $40,000 to the wedding florist, then blindly threw another $100,000 at various impatient vendors, who were actively threatening to completely boycott the upcoming ceremony. He watched the massive pile of cash dwindle at a terrifying rate. Silas and his heavily armed associates were now a permanent, terrifying fixture in his immediate future. The 40% weekly compounding interest was a mathematical death sentence. DeAndre tried to pour himself another glass of bourbon to steady his trembling hands, but the expensive crystal decanter slipped from his sweaty grip, shattering loudly against the marble floor. He stared blankly at the amber liquid pooling around his expensive Italian leather shoes. The absolute weight of his cascading lies was finally beginning to crush him alive. While DeAndre was silently suffocating under the immense pressure of his newly acquired underground debt, the rest of his entitled family was rapidly disintegrating. The toxic stress fractures I had carefully engineered were finally breaking the surface, tearing through their arrogant facade with brutal efficiency. His younger brother Trayvon was the first to experience a total collapse. Trayvon had spent the last 2 years aggressively riding DeAndre's coattails, pretending to be a brilliant financial prodigy. He had arrogantly dumped his entire savings along with heavily leveraged loans he had secured, using DeAndre's fake corporate backing into highly volatile cryptocurrency markets. Trayvon was sitting by the pool at his luxury rental home, bragging loudly to a group of friends about his genius investment strategies, when his mobile trading application triggered a series of catastrophic alerts. The obscure digital coin he had heavily backed suffered a massive coordinated rug pull. Within exactly 15 minutes, Trayvon watched his entire digital portfolio completely vaporize into nothing. He frantically refreshed the application over and over, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray as the digital numbers plunged into negative balances. He was entirely wiped out, leaving him holding hundreds of thousands of dollars in aggressively leveraged personal debt. The devastating reality of his financial ruin arrived less than 2 hours later in the form of a loud, aggressive diesel tow truck. Trayvon was still pacing around the edge of his pool in a state of absolute shock when he heard the heavy hydraulic gears grinding outside his front window. He sprinted out the front door, slipping wildly on the concrete walkway. 2 large, unsympathetic repo men were efficiently hooking thick metal chains to the front axle of his pristine, custom-wrapped Porsche. "Wait, stop right there!" Trayvon screamed, waving his arms frantically as he ran down the driveway. "There is a massive mistake. You cannot take that car. I am transferring funds right now." The larger of the 2 men simply handed him a neon green clipboard with a finalized repossession order. "Your leasing company disagrees, buddy," the man grunted indifferently. "You are 4 months behind on payments. The bank officially owns it now." Trayvon watched in total humiliation as his neighbors stepped out onto their manicured lawns, watching the noisy spectacle with eager, judgmental eyes. He tried to puff out his chest, trying to maintain his fake affluent image, but the desperate, panicked sweat soaking through his designer shirt completely betrayed him. His entire false identity was being dragged down the street behind a rusty tow truck. Desperate for an immediate bailout, Trayvon called DeAndre 20 times in a row, but his frantic calls were universally ignored. The financial rot was spreading rapidly, and Kendra was the next family member to hit a concrete wall. She burst into DeAndre's corporate office late that afternoon, completely ignoring his terrified, overwhelmed assistant. Kendra was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic margin call and the dangerous loan sharks her brother was currently dealing with. She only cared about maintaining her own ridiculous illusion of luxury. She marched directly up to his desk, slamming her designer handbag down onto the polished wood. DeAndre, I need $50,000 transferred into my personal account by tonight, Kendra demanded, her voice shrill and dripping with absolute entitlement. The wedding is in exactly 3 days, and I need a new custom gown for the rehearsal dinner. My current dress is completely unacceptable, and my private stylist requires an immediate cash retainer. I also need to clear my credit cards so I can book the post-wedding spa retreat with Camille's elite friends. DeAndre slowly lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were completely bloodshot, carrying dark, heavy bags underneath. He looked absolutely feral. Are you completely out of your mind? DeAndre snarled, his voice trembling with a terrifying, unhinged rage. You storm into my office, interrupting me to demand $50,000 for a stupid dress. Kendra crossed her arms, rolling her eyes with dramatic annoyance. Do not act broke now, DeAndre. You are marrying a billionaire heiress this weekend. Stop being selfish and wire me the money right now. I have a reputation to maintain in front of Atlanta society. The sheer blinding arrogance of her demand finally broke whatever fragile restraint DeAndre had left. He snapped entirely. He jumped up from his leather chair with such explosive violence that the heavy piece of furniture slammed hard against the glass wall behind him. He swept his arm forcefully across his desk, sending his expensive monitor's files and decorative pens crashing violently to the floor. Kendra shrieked in absolute terror, stumbling backward toward the door. "Shut up!" DeAndre roared, his face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate fury. "I do not have $50,000. I do not have anything. My entire company is drowning. I am being sued for millions. I have men who will physically break my legs if I do not pay them back by next week. Get out of my face before I completely lose it." Kendra stared at him, her mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated horror. She had never seen her brother so utterly destroyed, so incredibly dangerous. The protective sibling bond they supposedly shared shattered instantly, replaced by sheer panic. She turned and sprinted out of the office, fleeing the rapidly sinking corporate ship. While her children were spiraling into total madness, Vivian was trapped inside her own private, agonizing purgatory. She was sitting in the massive, overly decorated living room of her sprawling suburban mansion, clutching a small amber prescription bottle. She popped another anxiety pill, swallowing it dry as her hands shook uncontrollably. The devastating reality of my threat in the restaurant lobby was echoing relentlessly through her mind. Apex Holdings owned the secret mortgage on her house. I was the chairwoman. The crippling penalty interest rates were set to trigger immediately after the wedding weekend. She was entirely ruined. She was going to lose the house, her social standing, and every single thing she had bragged about for the last 5 years. Her heart pounded erratically against her ribs, making it difficult to pull a full breath into her lungs. The doorbell chimed loudly, sending a massive shockwave of terror straight through her nervous system. She thought it was the process servers or the foreclosure agents coming to forcibly remove her from the premises. Vivian forced herself to stand up. She stumbled toward the grand entryway, leaning heavily against the wall for support. When she opened the heavy wooden door, she was greeted by Camille. The young heiress looked absolutely radiant, holding a massive binder full of finalized wedding seating charts. Camille was completely, blissfully oblivious to the absolute carnage currently tearing her future family apart. "Vivian, darling." Camille chirped happily, stepping past her into the grand foyer. "I brought the final floral mock-ups and the updated guest list. We need to decide where to seat the state senator. Are you all right? You look a little pale." Vivian swallowed hard, tasting the bitter chalk of the anxiety medication in the back of her throat. Her immense, suffocating pride absolutely refused to let her confess the truth. She could not look this wealthy, perfect girl in the eye and admit that she was a complete fraud, that her son was a desperate imposter, and that they were all entirely bankrupt. The sheer embarrassment would literally kill her. She forced a bright, completely artificial smile onto her trembling face. "I am perfectly fine, sweetheart." Vivian lied smoothly, her voice shaking only slightly. Just a minor headache from all the wonderful wedding excitement. Come inside. Let us leave Vivian to her pathetic performance. I had far more pressing matters to attend to across town. My afternoon was carefully scheduled around a highly confidential architectural inspection at the Zenith. It was a massive 30-story commercial high-rise I had recently acquired through a proxy firm connected to Apex Holdings. The building was located in a rapidly gentrifying commercial district and was currently undergoing a massive multi-million-dollar structural renovation. Because the entire ground floor was currently gutted down to the steel studs exposing raw concrete pillars, hanging electrical wires, and thick plastic sheeting over the large windows, the exterior appeared deceptively derelict. To the untrained eye, it looked like an abandoned warehouse waiting for a wrecking ball. I stood near the temporary security desk in the exact center of the dusty, echoing lobby, wearing a tailored gray business suit and reviewing a thick roll of architectural blueprints with my lead commercial contractor. We were intently discussing the intricate plumbing installation for a grand marble water feature when a sudden aggressive banging at the temporary plywood front entrance completely shattered the productive calm of our afternoon meeting. The heavy wooden door was shoved open violently, hitting the concrete wall with a loud, echoing crack. DeAndre stormed into the unfinished lobby, coughing dramatically and swatting away a thick cloud of white construction dust. He looked like an absolute wreck, though he was desperately trying to project his usual aura of toxic, untouchable superiority. His expensive designer suit was heavily wrinkled, his dark silk tie was completely crooked, and his bloodshot eyes were darting around the raw, unfinished space with an expression of intense, visible disgust. He had clearly used his last remaining financial favors to hire a desperate private investigator to track my location. He arrogantly assumed this active construction zone was the miserable, low-rent apartment building I had been forced to move into after he supposedly discarded me. He had absolutely no idea that I legally owned the entire city block. "Well, this is absolutely depressing," DeAndre sneered, his voice echoing loudly off the bare concrete walls. He kicked a stray piece of broken drywall across the floor, eyeing my contractor with absolute contempt. My contractor immediately tensed, curling his hands into fists, ready to throw the hostile intruder out onto the busy street. But I simply raised my right hand, giving him a silent, commanding signal to step away. I wanted to see exactly how deep this desperate fool was willing to dig his own grave. I slowly rolled up my architectural blueprints, keeping my facial expression entirely blank and unbothered. "What do you want, DeAndre?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any human emotion. He strutted across the dusty floor, acting as if he owned the entire building. "I see you have really hit rock bottom, Simone. Living in a condemned construction site surrounded by filth, I almost feel incredibly sorry for you." He stopped exactly 3 feet away from me, crossing his arms and looking down his nose with an infuriating smirk. "But I am actually here to offer you a massive opportunity. A chance to redeem yourself and finally prove that you were actually worth my valuable time." I stood perfectly still, my personal cell phone securely tucked inside the side pocket of my suit jacket. Before he had even entered the building, I had seen his luxury sports car pull up through the external security monitors. I had instinctively reached into my pocket and pressed record. Every single word he spoke was currently being captured in pristine high-definition audio. "I am listening," I replied calmly. DeAndre puffed out his chest completely, mistaking my cold silence for passive submission. "I need you to immediately go to a local bank and take out $100,000 in personal loans under your name," he demanded, speaking with a baffling level of absolute arrogance. "I need the cash wired directly to my private offshore account by tomorrow morning." I stared at him, genuinely astonished by the sheer magnitude of his expanding delusion. "You tracked me down to a dusty construction site, assuming I am living in absolute poverty, to demand that I take out $100,000 in fraudulent personal loans for you. It is the absolute least you can do," DeAndre snapped, running a visibly shaking hand through his messy hair. "I wasted 3 years of my prime life dealing with your boring, uninspired, completely pathetic personality. I elevated your miserable social status just by letting you stand next to me in public spaces. You owe me for that massive privilege, Simone." Besides, my lavish wedding is on Saturday. I just had an unexpected vendor issue, a minor liquidity gap because my primary capital is temporarily tied up in exclusive hedge funds. You are going to bridge that financial gap for me today. I tilted my head slightly, studying him like a fascinating, deeply flawed specimen inside a sterile laboratory. And what exactly happens if I refuse your incredibly generous offer to ruin my own credit score? I asked quietly. DeAndre's handsome face suddenly contorted into an ugly, highly malicious smirk. He reached into his wrinkled jacket pocket and aggressively pulled out his expensive smartphone. I highly suggest you cooperate immediately, Simone. He tapped the glowing screen a few times and then shoved the phone aggressively into my face. Look closely at this. I looked down at the bright screen. My stomach gave a slight involuntary lurch, not from paralyzing fear, but from sheer, unadulterated disgust. Displayed clearly on his phone were highly explicit, incredibly inappropriate, digitally altered photographs. The face in the graphic images was undeniably mine, perfectly matched and seamlessly blended, but the exposed body was someone else entirely. It was a highly sophisticated, deeply malicious deepfake generated by artificial intelligence. I had a dedicated team of digital security experts on my payroll who could easily trace and destroy these files within hours. But DeAndre genuinely believed he held the ultimate weapon of mass destruction in the palm of his sweaty hand. I paid top dollar for these images on the dark web, DeAndre whispered, his voice dripping with venomous malice. They are absolutely flawless. If you do not wire me that $100,000 by tomorrow morning, I am sending these photos to every single person in your contact list. I will send them to your former coworkers, your distant friends, and every local business networking group in Atlanta. I will completely destroy your professional reputation overnight. You will never get a respectable job in this city again. You will be a total outcast. He pulled the phone back, slipping it safely into his pocket, completely convinced he had just checkmated me. He took a menacing step closer, invading my personal space, his breath reeking of stale bourbon, cheap mints, and absolute desperation. But if you play nice and fetch me my cash, I will delete the digital files entirely. In fact, I will even give you a very special reward. Once I am happily married to Camille and have officially secured her family fortune, I will set you up in a slightly better apartment. I will let you be my secret mistress. You can stay on permanent standby for whenever I eventually get bored with my billionaire wife. He actually smiled, a genuine repulsive expression of supreme misplaced confidence. He truly believed he was graciously offering me the romantic deal of a lifetime. He thought he was a brilliant criminal mastermind, outsmarting everyone around him, manipulating the entire board to secure his ultimate victory. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes, and for the very first time since this entire ordeal began, I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel a burning desire for vengeance. I felt a cold, chilling sense of absolute pity. He was a small, exceptionally pathetic man, trapped in a shrinking prison of his own massive ego, rapidly running out of oxygen. "All right, DeAndre," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of the chaotic panic or miserable despair he was so eagerly waiting to hear. I kept my hand resting casually near my pocket, knowing that the digital recorder had flawlessly captured every single threat, every extortion demand, and every disgusting proposition. "I will make sure to send my wedding gift on your big day." DeAndre's arrogant smile widened into a massive, triumphant grin. He straightened his crooked tie, visibly relaxing, as if a massive weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. "I knew you would finally see reason, Simone. You always were incredibly easy to control once you understood your proper place. Have the money wired by noon tomorrow or the photos go live. Do not test me." He turned around rapidly, his expensive shoes crunching loudly against the drywall dust covering the concrete floor. He marched out the door, completely oblivious to his incoming destruction. I just smiled. Saturday arrived with the kind of brilliant, cloudless sky that money usually could not buy, though DeAndre and his delusional family certainly behaved as if they had purchased the weather itself. The Grand Orchid, a historic and expensive estate on the exclusive edge of Atlanta, served as the opulent backdrop for the wedding of the century. The sprawling, immaculately manicured grounds were entirely saturated with excessive gaudy floral arrangements. Millions of rare white orchids spilled over the wrought iron gates and completely smothered the pristine marble fountains. It was a suffocating display of forced prestige, designed specifically to mask their rotting financial reality. Over 300 of the city's most elite socialites, influential politicians, and wealthy corporate titans were currently seated in perfectly aligned rows of imported velvet chairs set up across the expansive main lawn. A highly acclaimed classical string quartet played softly in the background, providing an elegant soundtrack that masked the toxic, volatile reality bubbling just beneath the surface of this incredibly expensive illusion. Vivian was actively patrolling the manicured aisles, ignoring the terrifying fact she was bankrupt, and her own massive suburban home was currently entering active legal foreclosure. She strutted around the massive estate, acting like absolute royalty, her heavy silk gown sweeping across the green grass as she aggressively greeted the wealthy attendees. She flashed brilliant, entirely fake smiles at Camille's highly influential relatives, desperately trying to cement her fragile social status among the true Atlanta elite. Vivian firmly believed that once this lavish ceremony officially concluded, her entire family would be permanently shielded from any impending financial ruin by Camille's immense generational wealth. She casually adjusted her expensive diamond earrings, completely oblivious to the catastrophic, perfectly orchestrated reality rapidly descending upon her perfectly curated fantasy. DeAndre stood confidently at the front of the grand floral altar, looking exactly like a man who had successfully conquered the entire world. He wore a custom-tailored white tuxedo that sharply contrasted against the vibrant green lawn and the dark mahogany archway. His posture was perfectly rigid, his chin tilted slightly upward in an arrogant display of total victory. He genuinely thought he had successfully neutralized me during our brief confrontation at the dusty construction site. He assumed his pathetic, highly illegal extortion attempt had worked perfectly, and that my supposed $100,000 wire transfer was currently sitting safely inside his hidden offshore accounts, satisfying the violent loan shark Silas and his heavily armed associates. DeAndre was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, mentally taking a triumphant victory lap before the race had even officially finished. He looked out over the sea of wealthy guests, thoroughly convinced his elaborate multi-million-dollar house of cards was finally secure and permanently untouchable. The classical music abruptly shifted, swelling into the majestic traditional bridal march. The 300 wealthy guests collectively stood, turning their immediate attention toward the heavy wooden doors of the main historic estate house. Camille slowly emerged, looking like a glittering, completely oblivious princess stepping out of a fairy tale. She was absolutely dripping in flawless, incredibly heavy family diamonds that caught the bright afternoon sun and reflected blinding prisms of light across the lawn. Her custom gown featured a dramatically long silk train that required 3 separate highly paid attendants to manage as she slowly glided down the pristine white silk aisle runner. She locked eyes with DeAndre, her face radiating pure, uninterrupted, absolute joy. She had absolutely no idea that the handsome, supposedly successful corporate mogul waiting for her at the floral altar was currently drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt and facing severe criminal charges for massive financial fraud and corporate extortion. The officiant, a highly respected local judge, stepped forward to begin the sacred ceremony, gently raising his hands to silence the eagerly watching crowd. Just as the distinguished officiant opened his mouth to speak the very first words of the welcoming address, a deep, highly aggressive mechanical rumble abruptly interrupted the quiet elegance of the historic estate. The heavy iron gates at the main entrance of the Grand Orchid were violently shoved open, scraping loudly against the concrete driveway. A massive, highly coordinated fleet of imposing black SUVs roared up the long gravel path, their heavy tires kicking up thick, blinding clouds of white dust that drifted over the expensive floral arrangements. The dark vehicles moved with absolute terrifying precision, braking sharply and forming a solid, impenetrable barricade directly behind the velvet seating area. The string quartet stopped playing instantly, their wooden bows freezing mid-air as a heavy, uncomfortable silence descended upon the lawn. The 300 elite guests turned their heads in mass confusion, quiet murmurs of shock and outrage rippling rapidly through the wealthy crowd. Camille stopped walking completely, her heavy diamond necklace clinking softly as she turned to look over her shoulder in complete bewilderment. DeAndre dropped his smug smile instantly, his handsome face rapidly draining of all its color, as raw, unadulterated panic flooded his wide eyes. The doors of the black SUVs opened simultaneously in a highly synchronized display of sheer, uncompromising authority. The Fulton sheriff stepped out of the lead vehicle, his polished gold badge gleaming brightly against his crisp, dark uniform. He was flanked tightly by a dozen heavily armed civil enforcement officers, and my entire ruthless corporate legal team all clutching thick, legally binding stacks of finalized court orders. They did not pause or offer any polite, superficial apologies for aggressively interrupting the extravagant, highly publicized ceremony. The sheriff marched aggressively down the exact center of the pristine white silk aisle runner, his heavy black boots leaving dark, dirty footprints across the expensive fabric. The wealthy guests physically recoiled, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored suits away from the incoming officers, as if the police were carrying a highly contagious disease. Vivian gasped loudly, clutching her chest dramatically, as she stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a massive marble vase filled with white orchids. Her carefully constructed facade of wealthy superiority instantly evaporated, replaced by genuine suffocating terror. DeAndre remained completely frozen at the floral altar, his perfectly manicured hands trembling visibly at his sides. The Fulton County Sheriff stopped exactly 2 feet away from the wooden archway, completely ignoring the confused, wealthy bride standing just a few yards away. He unrolled a massive legal document with a sharp flick of his wrist, his deep, commanding voice booming loudly across the silent, completely shocked estate. DeAndre Vance, the sheriff, announced loudly, projecting his voice to ensure that every single elite guest sitting in the velvet chairs heard the devastating words. By immediate order of the Fulton County Superior Court, your entire corporate entity has been officially seized and frozen. You are currently under active criminal investigation for massive financial fraud, egregious breach of standard corporate contract, and multiple severe counts of aggressive corporate extortion. All of your personal bank accounts, your business holding accounts, and your heavily leveraged luxury assets are now under strict, permanent legal receivership. The entire crowd of elite socialites erupted in a loud, chaotic cacophony of shocked gasps and frantic whispered conversations. Camille dropped her expensive custom-arranged bouquet, the rare white orchids scattering wildly across the green grass as she stared at DeAndre in sheer absolute horror. But the Fulton County Sheriff was not finished delivering his absolute, meticulously planned destruction. Furthermore, he continued, his booming voice easily slicing through the rising panic and confusion of the wealthy crowd. This specific historical property, commonly known as the Grand Orchid, was quietly acquired and fully purchased by Apex Holdings exactly 48 hours ago. Your family is currently in severe, unquestionable default on all associated venue rental fees and required luxury vendor deposits. Therefore, you are actively trespassing on private corporate commercial property. The true verified owner of Apex Holdings has officially and permanently revoked your temporary access rights to this entire estate. The sheriff slowly turned his hardened, uncompromising gaze toward the massive crowd of confused, highly panicked socialites who were now frantically whispering and pointing directly at the ruined groom. I am issuing a direct official order for an immediate mandatory evacuation of these entire historic premises, the Fulton County Sheriff commanded loudly, raising his hand and signaling to the dozens surrounding civil enforcement officers to begin aggressively clearing the velvet chairs. Every single person currently seated on this lawn must vacate the property within exactly 10 minutes, or you will be strictly subject to immediate physical arrest for blatant criminal trespassing on private corporate grounds. You are instructed to move directly to the main exits and completely abandon the immediate area. The sheer terrifying magnitude of the absolute financial destruction finally landed with crushing force. The elaborate, carefully maintained illusion of DeAndre's immense, untouchable wealth finally shattered into a million unfixable, permanently broken pieces right in front of the most powerful families in the entire city of Atlanta. The magnificent multi-million-dollar wedding ceremony had officially transformed into a brutal, highly public eviction. DeAndre was not going down quietly. He writhed violently against the firm grip of the two imposing civil enforcement officers, his custom white tuxedo jacket ripping loudly along the shoulder seam as he desperately tried to break free. "This is a massive mistake," he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer unadulterated panic as the cold steel handcuffs dug painfully into his wrists. "You have the entirely wrong man. My company is perfectly fine. I am a highly respected corporate executive in this powerful city. You absolutely cannot do this to me." He wildly thrashed his head around, frantically searching the fleeing crowd for anyone who could physically intervene. "Where is the owner of Apex Holdings? I demand to speak to the exact owner right now. Bring them out here immediately so I can quickly clear up this ridiculous accounting error." He was practically foaming at the mouth, his perfectly manicured image completely dissolved into feral, animalistic desperation. He shouted loudly that he had millions of dollars safely hidden in exclusive offshore accounts, that he was currently marrying a powerful billionaire, and that he would personally ensure every single officer on the lawn was aggressively fired by morning. The Fulton County Sheriff simply watched him flail with an expression of profound, unshakable boredom. "Your financial delusions are completely over, Vance," the sheriff stated flatly, stepping aside as the frightened crowd quickly parted. "The owner of Apex Holdings is already here." I slowly opened the heavy door of my chauffeured town car and stepped out onto the gravel driveway. I wore a perfectly tailored midnight black power suit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. My heels clicked sharply against the pavement, the sound cutting through the chaotic noise of the ruined wedding like a metronomic countdown to DeAndre's final doom. The remaining guests, the fleeing vendors, and the scattering family members suddenly froze in total disbelief as I confidently walked through the iron gates and moved purposefully up the exact center of the white silk aisle runner. I did not bother to look at the incredibly expensive floral arrangements or the overturned velvet chairs scattered around the lawn. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the pathetic, handcuffed man kneeling helplessly in the dirt at the altar. DeAndre stopped thrashing instantly. His mouth hung open in silent, suffocating horror as his bloodshot eyes fully registered my unexpected presence. The warm color completely drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost. Beside him, Vivian had temporarily stopped her hysterical wailing. She stared up at me from her ruined designer gown, her jaw trembling violently as the terrifying, undeniable reality of the situation finally began to penetrate her thick skull. The entire entitled family was rendered completely, utterly speechless. I had successfully orchestrated their absolute ruin, and they were just now realizing I held the ultimate detonator. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of DeAndre, looking heavily down at him with an expression of cold, clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of lingering anger anymore. I only felt the supreme, intoxicating satisfaction of my ultimate victory. I slowly reached into my designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of finalized legal documents. "These are the complete financial records of your deeply fraudulent shell companies," I stated clearly, my voice echoing powerfully across the silent lawn. I dropped the heavy files directly onto his expensive Italian leather shoes. "These are the official eviction notices for your downtown luxury penthouse." I dropped a second thick stack of papers onto his lap. "And this," I said, holding up a small digital drive for the entire stunned crowd to see, "contains the pristine, high-definition audio recording of the pathetic, highly illegal extortion attempt you made at my construction site yesterday. I forwarded it directly to the district attorney this morning." DeAndre let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, shaking his head in absolute denial. "You cannot possibly be the owner," he whimpered, his voice barely a quiet breath. "You are absolutely nothing." I smiled a sharp, merciless expression. I own everything, DeAndre. I own the corporate debts you failed to pay. I own the proxy firm that bought out your penthouse lease. I even own this historic venue you are currently trespassing on. You tried to destroy me, but you only managed to dig your own grave. Camille had been standing just a few yards away, tightly clutching her wealthy father's arm as she watched the entire dramatic confrontation unfold in absolute stunned silence. The sheer shock on her face was rapidly transforming into a burning righteous fury. She took a confident step forward, completely ignoring the muddy grass currently ruining her expensive silk train. She looked directly at the sheriff. "How much money does he actually owe, Camille?" demanded her voice remarkably sharp and deeply commanding. The sheriff briefly glanced at his customized clipboard. "Currently, Mr. Vance is approximately $2.5 million in severe corporate and personal debt, ma'am." Camille let out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh that echoed loudly against the stone walls of the estate. She instantly turned her furious gaze back to DeAndre, who was now weeping openly, tears streaming down his face as he desperately begged her to listen to him. "You are a complete fraud," she spat, stepping right up to him. She raised her hand and delivered a sharp, violently echoing slap directly across his left cheek. The sudden sound cracked like a whip. She quickly grabbed her left hand violently, pulling the massive, heavily financed diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw the expensive jewelry directly into the dirt at his feet. "Have fun in federal prison, you pathetic loser," she snarled. Camille turned her back on him forever, taking her father's arm and walking proudly away from the ruined altar, taking her generational wealth and his only remaining lifeline with her. The absolute devastating karma was cascading rapidly, now hitting every single participating member of his highly toxic family with brutal, completely unforgiving precision. A second heavily marked squad car suddenly pulled up to the outer edge of the main lawn, its bright sirens blaring loudly into the afternoon air. Two local police officers quickly stepped out, marching purposefully toward the thick perimeter hedges where Trayvon and Kendra were desperately trying to hide themselves. Trayvon Vance, one of the serious officers, called out instantly, drawing his heavy metal handcuffs. "We recently received a highly detailed, completely verified anonymous tip regarding your extremely fraudulent recent cryptocurrency leverage schemes. You are officially under arrest right now for severe credit card fraud and massive federal wire theft." Trayvon immediately shrieked in sheer, unadulterated panic, desperately trying to run away, but he slipped violently on the wet grass and was immediately forcefully pinned to the muddy ground by the two officers. Kendra screamed in absolute high-pitched terror, quickly covering her ruined face and fleeing blindly toward the busy street, selfishly abandoning her younger brother without a second thought. Vivian, helplessly watching her precious, entitled children being systematically arrested and hauled away in heavy metal chains, finally broke completely. She crawled pathetically across the muddy silk aisle runner on her hands and knees, completely ruining her expensive designer dress. She reached out with heavily trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the clean hem of my perfectly tailored trousers. "Simone, please," she sobbed hysterically, her carefully maintained elite facade entirely and permanently destroyed. "You have clearly made your point today. I am absolutely begging you for your mercy. Please do not take my family home. Please help us." I slowly stepped backward, ensuring her dirty, desperate hands did not touch my pristine suit. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman who had spent years making me feel invisible and unworthy. The woman who had encouraged her son to discard me like trash so he could climb the social ladder. She was now kneeling in the dirt, begging for scraps of mercy from the same woman she had tormented. I stood tall, the warm afternoon sun casting a long dark shadow over her shaking frame. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring the heavy weight of her total humiliation settled deep into her bones. "You were right, Vivian," I said softly, my voice carrying a cold, chilling finality that sharply cut through her hysterical sobbing. "We absolutely are not in the same class." I looked her directly in the tearful eyes, permanently stripping away the last remaining shreds of her pathetic, unearned pride. "Your class is completely beneath my feet." I turned my back on the entire ruined family without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering regret. The officers hauled DeAndre and Trayvon toward the waiting squad cars as I walked gracefully back down the aisle. I stepped into the quiet luxury of my awaiting town car, pulled out my phone, and blocked DeAndre's number forever, finally stepping into my bright, fiercely independent future.